Okay, so to make a recap of our definition of referential theory of meaning, we understand that a widespread idea about meaning is that words have their meanings by standing for things in the world. Meaning, what they mean is what they stand for, and that words are like labels. They are symbols that represent, designate, name, denote, or refer to items or ideas in the world. Although the theory may seem commonsensical or accurate, right? But from Dr. Lawrence's discussion last time, we know it is inadequate, and we are even presented some objections. So with those objections, we can conclude that the theory does not hold for all words, but it may apply to singular terms or expressions that purport to denote or designate individual people, places, or other objects. In English language or any other natural language, the paradigmatic referring devices are the singular terms. These are expressions that purport to denote or designate particular individual people, places, or other objects, as opposed to general terms such as dog or brown that can apply to more than one thing. So singular terms like proper names, let's say for example Teacher Jane, the name of President Rodrigo Duterte, Jakarta, number 7, 3:17 p.m., and definite descriptions such as the Queen of England, the cat on the mat, the last department meeting but one. Singular personal pronouns such as you, he, or she, demonstrative pronouns such as this and that. So even if the referential theory of meaning is not true across the board, one might reasonably expect it to be true of singular. However, Gottlob Frege in 1892 and Bertrand Russell in 1905 powerfully argued that definite descriptions, at least, do not mean what they mean in virtue of denoting what they denote. Right? So Frege and Russell here set forth 4 puzzles about singular terms. That first 3 of which were discussed in some of the chapters of the. So here is our 4 puzzles on singular terms. First, we have the problem of apparent reference to non-existence. Second, the problem of negative existentials. Next, we have Frege puzzles about identity, and the 4th one is a problem of substituity. So with our first puzzle, the problem of apparent reference to non-existence, let us consider sentence 1. James Moriarty is bald. So the context of the sentence is that we refer to Professor Moriarty in Sherlock Holmes' arch enemy, described most fully in Conan Doyle's story, The Final Problem 1. So the following set of statements, which is presented in the next slide, is inconsistent. That is, on pain of logical contradiction, the statements cannot all be true. Considering the problem of apparent reference to non-existence, the first statement is that sentence 1 is meaningful. Alright, you know that. Sentence 1 is subject-predicate sentence. We also know that. J3, a meaningful subject-predicate sentence is meaningful only in the virtue of it speaking out some individual thing and ascribing some property to that thing. J4 says that sentence 1 subject term fails to pick out or denote anything that exists. Alright? J5, if sentence 1 is meaningful only in virtue of picking out a thing and ascribing a property to that thing, either J1, J2, or J3, and if sentence 1 subject term fails to pick out anything that exists, that's J4, then either sentence 1 is not meaningful after all, that is contrary to what J1 says, picks out a thing that does not exist. Right? J6 states that there is no such thing as non-existent thing. The rub is that every one of J1 to J6 seems to be true. That's according to the problem of apparent reference to non-existent. Next, we have the problem of negative existentials. This is a special case of the foregoing puzzle, but as we shall see, an aggravated one. Consider sentence 2, Pegasus never existed. Alright, so sentence 2, if you can see, seems to be true and seems to be about Bellerophon's steed, which is named Pegasus. But if sentence 2 is true, sentence 2 cannot be about Pegasus, for there is no such entity for it to be about. Likewise, if sentence 2 is about Pegasus, then it is false, for Pegasus must then, in some sense, exist. So, it is worth noting a previous solution to the problems of apparent reference to non-existence and negative existentials, rejected by Frigg and later even more vehemently so by Russell. J1 statement is uncontroversial, J2 seems obvious, J4 is just a fact, and J5 is trivially true. Alexis Manon here, who is famous for his belief on non-existent objects, had boldly leapt to deny J6, insisting that any possible object of thought, right, even a self-contradictory one, as being a sort of even though only a few such things are so lucky as to exist in reality as well. Because considering our character a while ago, Moriarty has a being of that sort and can be referred to, even though fortunately for England and the world, he lacks the property of existing. So, less implausibly, Frigg himself dealt with apparent reference to non-existence by rejecting J3. He posited abstract entities that he called senses, and argued that a singular term is meaningful in virtue of having one of those over and above its referent, or in the case of non-referring singular term, instead of a referent. That is, since the singular term expresses a sense, it is meaningful whether or not it actually refers to some things in the world. So we have Frigg's puzzle about identity as our third puzzle. An identity statement such as Mark Twain is Samuel Langhorne Clemens. If we can see, the sentence contains two singular terms, both of which, if the statement is true, pick out or denote the same person or thing. It seems then that what the statement says is simply that that person is identical with that person, that that person is identical with himself. If so, then the statement is trivial. Number 3 or sentence 3 says no more than Mark Twain is Mark Twain. Yet, 3 seems non-trivial in each of two ways. First, 3 is informative in that someone might learn something new upon reading sentence 3. Either something about Twain's actual identity or that Clemens was the famous author. Second, sentence 3 is contingent. As philosophers say, the fact 3 or sentence 3 states is one that need not have held. Reality could have been otherwise. So, it seems that at least one of the singular terms figuring in sentence 3 must have and contribute some kind of meaning over and above its referent. Next, we have the problem of substitutivity. The function of a singular term is to pick out an individual thing and to introduce that thing into discourse. Even if one stops short of the anti-referential theory of meaning, one might think it is in virtue of that denoting role that singular terms are meaningful at all. Therefore, we would expect that any two singular terms that denote one and the same thing would be semantically equivalent. We could take any sentence containing one of the terms and substitute the other of the two for the first term without changing the meaning, or at least without changing the truth value of the sentence. But let us consider sentence 4. Which says, Albert believes that Samuel Langhorne Clemens was less than 5 feet tall. And suppose sentence 4 is true. Now, Albert is unaware that Clemens wrote novels and stories under the pen name Twain. We cannot substitute the term Mark Twain for Samuel Langhorne Clemens in our sentence 4 without changing the sentence 4's truth value. The result is a false sentence, since we may suppose Albert has seen a photo of Twain and believes that he was of normal height. In previous reports, if we can remember, in 1960, with Quinn's terminology on the sentential position occupied by the name, right? The sentential position occupied by the name we have in our sentence 4 is referentially opaque. Opaque for short, as opposed to referentially transparent. Opaque in this context means just that substituting a different singular term into that position may change the truth value of that containing sentence. So what causes opacity is the beliefs that construction, since the sentence Samuel Langhorne Clemens was less than 5 feet tall, standing up. So, in his theory of descriptions, Russell initially posed the 4 puzzles in terms of definite descriptions rather than proper names because he was interested in the logic of the word or article the. And not too surprisingly, Russell here argued on the basis of the puzzles that definite descriptions do have and contribute meanings that go beyond the reference alone. His theory takes the form of a contextual definition of the word the, as it occurs in typical definite descriptions. That is, rather than defining the word explicitly, Russell offers a recipe for paraphrasing standard types of full sentences containing the article the in such a way as to exhibit the role of the word the indirectly and to reveal what he called the sentence's logical forms. Let's say, for example, the whale is mama, right? He does not here treat plural uses of the or the generic use of the article the, okay, considering the given sentence a while ago, the whale is mama. Second, definite descriptions can be formed without the use of the article the. For example, by way of possessive, as in my brother or Doris' egg salad sandwich, though perhaps we might paraphrase those along the lines of the brother of me. So it is worth noting a previous solution to the problems of apparent reference to non-existence and negative existentials, which was rejected by Frigg and later even more vehemently so by Russell. Alright? Okay, so here is Russell's contextual definition of the article the. Alright, let us take the sentence number 5. The author of Waverley was Scotch. If we can see, sentence 5 appears to be a simple subject-predicate sentence referring to an individual, which is Sir Walter Scott, and predicating something, Scottishness, of him. But appearances are deceiving, Russell says, right? Notice that the ostensible singular term, the author of Waverley, consists of our troublesome word troublesome word, I forgot the term, troublesome word the pasted onto the front of a predicative expression. And also notice too that the meaning of that expression figures crucially in our ability to recognize or pick out the expression's referent. To find the reference, we have to look for someone who did write Waverley. Russell suggests that the word the abbreviates a more complex construction involving what logicians and linguists call quantifiers, words that quantify general terms such as all teenagers, some bananas, 6 geese laying, most police officers, no light bulbs, and the like. So indeed, he thinks that sentence 5 as a whole abbreviates a conjunction of 3 quantified general statements, none of which makes reference to Scotch in particular. 5A, we have at least one person authored Waverley. 5B, at most one person authored Waverley. And 5C, we have whoever authored Waverley was Scotch. Alright, so each of 5A to 5C is intuitively necessary for the truth of our sentence 5. If the author of Waverley was Scotch, then there was such an author. If there were more than one author, the article the should not have been used. And if the author was Scotch, it follows trivially that whoever did the authoring was. Right? And 5A to 5C taken together certainly seems sufficient for the truth of our sentence 5. So we seem to have a set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for our sentence 5. That in itself is a powerful argument for, according to Russell's analysis. Current reference to non-existence, Russell put the problem of apparent reference to non-existence in terms of sentence 6, which says that the present king of France is bald. Okay, so we turn then to the inconsistent set of statements corresponding to J1 to J6 above, kanina. Replacing our sentence 1, ano ang sentence 1 natin? James Moriarty is bald, with sentence 6, the King of France is bald. And relettering the statements with K instead of J, our J1 instead of K1. Let's say for example, thus statement K1, ano nga yung sabi sa K1? We have J1, statement 1 or statement 6 is meaningful, alright? With, meaning to say, the sentence 6, the King of France is bald, is significant and not meaningless. K2 is, ano sabi sa K2 natin kanina? We have, subject or sentence is a subject predicate sentence, alright? K2 is sentence 6, is a subject predicate sentence, and so on. Now, let us paraphrase sentence 6 according to the foregoing method. At least one person is presently King of France, more perspicuously, presently King's France. And at most one person is presently King of France, and whoever is presently King of France is bald. There's no problem. The first of the foregoing 3 conjuncts is simply false. Since no one King's France at present, so our sentence 6 itself comes out false on Russell's analysis. When we first stated the puzzle, it looks as though one had to reject either the J3 or K3 this time, or J6 or our J6 and then K6 this time, since J2 seemed as obvious as the other undeniable J statements. But now, Russell ingeniously denies statement K2. Diba? Our sentence 6 is a subject-predicate sentence. Since he denies that the present King of France is really a singular term. Of course, our sentence, the present king of France, has subject-predicate form in a superficial grammatical way. But notice again that our three conjuncts are all general statements and that none mentions any specific individual corresponding to the alleged king. The king figures nowhere in logical form as the subject. So, alternately and accordingly, less grammatically, we could keep K2. The sentence is subject predicate sentence, all right, understanding it as alluding to superficial grammatical form, and rejects K3 on the grounds that a superficially subject predicate sentence can be meaningful without picking out any particular individual because it abbreviates a trio of purely general terms. Let us now apply Russell's analysis to 7. The present king of France does not exist. Okay, now there is a resilient paraphrase of our sentence 7 that leaves the sentence just as anomalous as it seems to the naive hearer. That is the paraphrase that takes exists to be an ordinary predicate like was Scotch or is bald, and takes not to modify or apply to the predicate. At least one person is presently king of France, and at most one person is presently king of France, and whoever is presently king of France does not exist. So the anomaly is that the first conjunct asserts the existence of a present king, while the third conjunct denies it. No wonder our sentence 7 sounds peculiar to us. To make sense of 7, we must understand not. Okay, not as modifying the verb exist, but as applying to the rest of 7 as whole. Thus, not the present king of France exists. That is, it is false that the present king of France exists, which is obviously what would be meant by someone who uttered our sentence 7 seriously. Then we apply Russell's pattern of analysis inside the word not. Okay, so in considering Russell's analysis with PhDAL, let us have an example featuring a definite description. We have sentence 8, which says the present Queen of England is one and the same individual as Elizabeth Windsor. Our sentence 8's left-hand term is a definite description. So let us paraphrase it away in Russell's manner. We have at least one person is presently Queen of England. Yeah, presently Queens of England. And at most one person is presently Queen of England. And whoever is presently Queen of England is one and the same as Elizabeth Windsor. So now we easily see why our original identity statement is non-trivial. Of course, we learn something when we hear Russell's paraphrase, something substantive about Elizabeth and the present queen both. And of course, the identity statement is contingent. Since someone else might have been queen, there might even have been no queen at all. Elizabeth might have run away from home and formed a rock band rather than be crowned, or whatever. So the theory of description seems to give a correct account of the identity statement's intuitive content. Note that on Russell's view, the statement is only superficially an identity statement. Really, it is a predication and attributes a complex relational property to Elizabeth. That leaves us with the problem of how a real identity statement could manage to be both true and informative, more of which in the previous discussions. Now, in substitutivity, let us return to Albert. Alright? He has been reading philosophy, and sentence 9 says that Albert believes that the author of Nothing and Beingness is profound thinker. Okay, so now Our Albert here is unaware that the author of nothingness and beingness moonlights by writing cheap, disgusting pornography. We cannot substitute the term the author of sizzling veterinarians for the author of nothing and beingness in our sentence 9 without changing sentence 9's truth value. The result is a false sentence since Albert believes that the author of Sizzling Veterinarians is a drooling moron. Alright, I'm afraid this reveals that that Albert has read Sizzling Veterinarians. The position occupied by the definite description in our sentence 9 is opaque. So in our sentence 9, the definite description occurs as part of what Albert believes. So we shall start our Russellian paraphrase with Albert believes and then apply Russellian's pattern of analysis, giving the description secondary occurrence or narrow scope. So we have Albert believes the following sentences. At least one person authored nothing and beingness, and at most one person authored nothing and beingness, and whoever authored nothing and beingness is profound thinker. This is a pretty good account of what Albert believes. And now it is obvious why we may not substitute the author of Sizzling Veterinarians into our sentence 9, for the corresponding analysis of the resulting sentence would come out such as Albert believes the following: at least one person authored Sizzling Veterinarians, and at most one person authored Sizzling Veterinarians, and whoever authored Sizzling Veterinarians is a profound thinker. So, since this attributes an entirely different belief to Albert, it is no wonder that it is false even though our sentence 9 is true. Of course, at the level of logical form, we have not made a substitution at all. For the singular terms have disappeared on analysis and are no longer there to be substituted. Okay, so to wrap it up, our four puzzles made it clear that definite descriptions do not hook onto the world by directly naming and nothing else. But we needed a positive theory of how they do hook onto it. Russell has provided one very well motivated theory. Notice that even though definite descriptions are not assigned reference in the way that names are, and even though they are not really singular terms at all, they still prefer to have single individuals that answer to them. When a description does in fact have the corresponding individual that it purports to have, that is when there does exist a nick and so on, so and so, we shall speak of the description's semantic denotation or semantic referent. But the hook, alright, between a definite description and its semantic referent is, on Russell's view, considering his views, far less direct than is the hook between a simple and its bearer. I hope you have learned. Thank you so much for listening.
A number of objections have been brought against the theory of descriptions. Objection 1. According to Russell, sentence 6, the present king of France is bald, is false owing to the lack of any such king. Strawson points out that verdict is implausible. Suppose someone comes out and asserts sentence 6, would that person's hearers react by saying, that's false, or I disagree? Surely not. Strawson maintains that the speaker has produced an ostensibly referring expression that has misfired. The speaker has simply failed to refer to anything and so has failed to make a complete statement. The speaker's adherence is certainly defective. It is not incorrect but abortive. It does not even get a chance to be false. Since no proper statement has been made in the first place, it follows that nothing either true or false has been said. Russell thought of a meaningful sentence as a sentence that has a meaning, a sentence that expresses a proposition. The propositions by their nature is either true or false. Strawson excludes talks of propositions and denies that sentences are the kind of things that can be true or false at all. Objection 2. Strawson further criticizes the claims which he attributes to Russell, that part of what a speaker would be asserting in uttering sentence 6 would be that there at present existed one and only one king of France. That claim is too implausible, for although the speaker presupposes that there is one and only one king, that is certainly not part of what the speaker asserts. Strawson is assuming on Russell's behalf that whatever is logically implied by a sentence is necessarily asserted by a speaker who utters. Strawson points out that many descriptions are context-bound. He uses this example. Sentence 10, the table is covered with books. Presumably, the subject term is a definite description used in standard way. Strawson has no monopoly on the fact that when someone says table, we hearers generally know which table is meant, because something in the context has made it salient. It may be the only one in sight, or the only one in the room, or the one we have just been talking about. Russell may say that there is ellipsis here, that in the context, the table is short for a more elaborate description that is uniquely satisfied. The ellipsis view has some disturbing implications. Russell thinks of logical form as objectively real, that sentences really do have the logical forms. If we say that the table means the table in this room, then we have introduced the concept room and construed sentence 10 is being literally about a room, indeed as having the predicate room hidden in its underlying logical structure. Perhaps the better approach restricted to quantification. For example, everyone likes her, meaning not every person in the universe, but everyone in a certain contextually indicated social circle. Nobody gets to that restaurant anymore, which is unlikely to mean that no human being at all goes there. Objection 4, we call this as Donnellan's distinction. Donnellan called attention to what he called the referential use, as opposed to the attributive use of a definite description. The most obvious type of referential use is when a description has grown capital letters and is used as a title. Example, the Holy Roman Empire, whose referent, as Voltaire observed, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Another example is the Great Dad, which is the name of a rock band. Sentences containing that title do not mean that at least one thing is grateful and dead now. Russell retorted that, as the capital letters show, those titles are not being used as descriptions at all, but as fuse titles. This one, for example, is the name of a piece of instrumental music by St. James, and sentences containing the titles are about music, not about waterfowl. Dunella shows that there are less formal cases in which we use descriptions solely to focus on a particular individual, regardless of what or that person or a thing's attributes. Example, in sentence 12, Smith's murderer is insane. This means that whoever committed this terrible crime is insane. Donnellan has no quarrel with Russell here. This is what he calls the attributive use of description. Donnellan's objection to the theory of descriptions is just that they overlooks the referential use. Russell writes as if all descriptions were used attributively. Against Strawson, Donnellan complains that equally he did not see the attributive use, that Strawson writes as if all descriptions used referentially, in a context, to draw somebody's attention to a particular person, place, or things. Both Strawson and Russell are mistaken in thinking that definite description always work in one way, because there is an ambiguity acknowledged by either. Donnellan does not take a position as to what kind of ambiguity it is. In particular, he does not try to decide whether the sentence 12 itself has two different meanings, explaining the description's evidently distinct uses. The speaker who uses a definite description referentially uses description to enable his audience to pick out whom or what he is talking about. Next is anaphora. As we have noted, Russell deals only with what he considers the central use of the and accepts the theory from having to explain plural use or the generic use. Russell does not mention anaphoric uses since there are ostensibly singular referring expressions. Anaphoric expression inherit its meaning from another expression or its antecedent. Take, for example, the sentence 15, the man who lived around the corner was eccentric. He used to snack on turtle heads. He refers back to the man who lived around the corner. Gitch or Gist, Gitch 1962 called such a term a pronoun laziness and suggested that it merely abbreviates a boilerplate repetition of the antecedent phrase so that sentence 15 second clause is precisely equivalent to the man who lived around the corner used to snack on turtle heads.
Good morning once again, Dr. Lau and classmates. This chapter is a continuation of the report of Ma'am Sambay and Ma'am Desiree. This chapter is about the proper names, the description theory. We may have agreed with Russell that the referential theory of meaning is false of description because descriptions are not really logically singular terms. But we may continue to hold the referential theory for proper names themselves. Surely, names are just names. They have their meaning simply by designating the particular things they designate and introducing those designata into discourse. Let us call such an expression a million name. Since John Stuart Mill, 1843-1973, seemed to defend the view that proper names are merely labels for individual persons or objects and contribute no more than those individuals themselves to the meanings of sentences in which they occur. But recall our initial objection to Russell's theory of descriptions that, although it was motivated entirely by the four puzzles, the puzzles are not at all specific to definite descriptions. Why? Because they arose just as insistently, not to mention first for proper names as well. Frege followed Russell in offering solutions to the puzzles. We have already seen what he said about the apparent reference to non-existence. Example number 1. James Moriarty is bald. This sentence is meaningful because the name James Moriarty has a sense over and above its putative referent. When we talk about putative, it means assumed to exist or have existed. So in fact, nothing is referred to or denoted by the name, but the sense is expressed by it. So for Frege, the sense was roughly a particular way of presenting the term putative referent. Sometimes, Frege expressed senses in the form of definite descriptions. For example, the sense of the name Aristotle might be Plato's disciple and the teacher of Alexander the Great, or the Stagirite teacher of Alexander. A sense determines a unique referent, but multiple senses may determine the same referent. Let us now see how Frege attacked the other three puzzles. So, the negative existentials. When we talk about negative existentials, it never exists. Sometimes, maybe it is a fantasy or the imagination. Look at the sentence number 2. Pegasus never existed. So, this sentence number 2 seems to be true and seems to be about Pegasus. But, if the sentence number 2 is true, sentence number 2 cannot be about Pegasus. Notice that there is a worse complication here than is raised by the problem of apparent reference to non-existence alone. Whereas, Sentence number 1 is meaningful despite the non-existence of James Moriarty. Sentence number 2 is not only meaningful despite Pegasus' non-existence, but actually an important truth. The idea of senses as particular modes of presentation affords Frege at least an impressionistic solution to the problem of negative existentials. Though whether this was actually his view and how it might be made precise is unclear, sentence number 2 can be taken to mean roughly that the sense of Pegasus, the conception of the winged horse ridden by Bellerophon, fails to find a referent, not even a non-existent one. Nothing in reality answered to that sense. So the reason this idea is not straightforward is that for Frege, a name only expresses and does not denote its own sense. So, sentence number 2 is not literally about the sense of Pegasus and does not out and out say of that the sense that it lacks a referent. Even though the later is one thing, the philosopher know that they know that the sentence number 2 is true. This sentence number 3 is an example of Frege's puzzle. Mark Twain is Samuel Langhorne Clemens. This sentence contains two proper names, Mark Twain, the other one is Samuel Langhorne Clemens, both of which pick out or denote the same person or thing, and so, if the names are million, should be trivially true. Yet, as before, this sentence number 3 seems both informative and contingent. On Frege's view, although the two names in sentence number 3 pick out a common referent, they present that individual in different ways, they have importantly different senses. And what he calls cognitive significance goes with the sense rather than with reference. Then this is what he writes. When we found A is equal to A and A is equal to B to have different cognitive values, the explanation is that for the purpose of knowledge, the sense of the sentence, viz., the thought expressed by it, is no less relevant than its reference. If now A is equal to B, then indeed the reference of B is the same as that of A, and hence the truth value of A is equal to B is the same as that of A is equal to A. In spite of this, the sense of B may differ from that of A, and thereby the thought expressed in A is equal to B differs from that of A is equal to A. In that case, the two sentences do not have the same cognitive value. But we are not told how it is that A is equal to B can be contingent. Another is substitutivity. Example, Albert believes that Samuel Langhorne Clemens was less than 5 feet tall, but substituting Mark Twain for Samuel Langhorne Clemens in sentence number 4 produces a falsehood. As in the previous chapter, the singular term position governed by beliefs that is referentially opaque. If the names were million and contributed nothing to meaning besides the introduction of the reference into discourse, the substitution should make no difference at all and the position would be transparent. Here, Frege makes an ingenious move. The problem, we recall, was that the opacity was induced by the beliefs that construction, since what follows it is not itself opaque. Since belief is a cognitive matter, Frege supposed that what determine a belief sentence's truth value are the senses rather than merely the reference of expression that follows the belief operator. Thus, Frege's distinction between reference and sense enables him to address each of the puzzles, and his solutions sound right. So far as they go, names contribute meaning of some sort over and above the reference. And that is what makes the differences where we see differences, of course. But the solutions sound right. French calls that added meaning, sense, but says little more about it. In particular, he does not say what sort of meaning it is or what positive contribution it makes. This has an air of labeling rather than solving the problem. Thus, French further hints that names can have the senses of description. That is just what Russell did, and it led him to a very rich approach to the puzzle. Russell's name claim. The claim is that everyday proper names are not really names, at least not genuine million names. They look like names and they sound like names when we say them out loud, but they are not names at the level of logical form, where expressions' logical properties are laid bare. Thus, Russell introduces the second semantic appearance reality distinctions, just as definite descriptions are singular terms only in the sense of surface grammar. The same, more surprisingly, is true of ordinary proper names themselves. So, if the name claim is true, then Russell's solution to the four puzzles does generalize after all, because we just replace the names by the definite descriptions they express. Thus, names do have what French thought of as senses that can differ despite sameness of referent, but Russell gives an analysis of this rather than taking them as primitive items of some abstract sort. So, it is important to see that the name claim is entirely independent of the theory of description itself, but some theorists hold the theory of description as a theory of definite descriptions themselves, while rejecting the name claim entirely. Less commonly, one could embrace the name claim but hold the theory of descriptions different from Russell's. In support of the theory of descriptions, Russell gave a direct argument, then he touted the theory's power in solving the puzzles. First, the Russell's direct defense of his theory of definite descriptions, and one of the toughest cases of all, a negative existential. Like the example number 2, Pegasus never existed. This sentence is actually true. What then could it mean? It does not pick out an existing thing and assert falsely that the thing is non-existent, nor does it pick out a Menominee entity and deny existence of it. It merely assures us that in fact there was no such winged horse. The second direct argument calls attention to a kind of clarificatory questions. Suppose you hear someone using a name, say, Lily Boulanger, and you do not know who the speaker is talking about. You ask who that is. The speaker replies, "Oh, the first woman ever to have won the Prix de Rome 1913 with her cantata Faust et Helene." And that is a proper answer. You ask because, so to speak, you did not understand the name you heard. In order to come to understand it, you had to ask a who question, and the answer had to be a description. Or we could use who question as a kind of testing, which might be called the spot check test. Suppose you use the name Wilfred Sellars. Who's that? All you can reply, all that comes out is the famous philosopher at Pittsburgh who wrote those really dense books. In general, when asked who do you mean, after one has just used a name, one immediately and instinctively comes up with a description as an explanation of what one means. Section number 1. Searle of 1958 complained that if proper names are equivalent to descriptions, then for each name there must be some particular description that it is equivalent to. For example, sentence number 5. Wilfred Sellars was an honest man. Given that uh, we know a fair number of individuating facts about Sellars, Searle tries out a couple of candidate description types and finds them one thing. Suppose that Wilfred Sellars is equivalent to the one and only thing X, such that X is F and X is G, and where F and G and the rest are all the predicates that would apply to the man in question. But this would have the nasty consequence that sentence number 5, as used, it entails. Another example is, there is at least one philosopher with whom I had a fairly violent argument in George Papa's living room in 1979. Sentence number 5 surely does not entail sentence number 6 for me or for anyone else. Now, the spot check test ought to supply a more local answer for each use of a name. And as we have seen, it is plausible to think that a speaker can normally cough up a fairly specific description when prodded. But it is unclear that this is always because the description was one the speaker already had determined in mind. If you ask me who is Sellars, I might make any of a number of answers that come to my mind, depending on what sort of information I think you may want about him. It hardly follows that the answer I do produce is a precise description that may use of Sellars' antecedent expressed. Notice, the complaint is not merely that it would be hard to find out which description a speaker had in mind in uttering some name. The stronger thesis is that, at least in many cases, there is no single determinate description that the speaker has in mind, either consciously or subconsciously. Undeniably, different people know different things about other people. In some cases, X's knowledge about Z and Y's knowledge about Z may not even overlap. Assuming that the descriptions with which names are supposed to be synonymous are in speakers' minds as revealed by the spot check test, it follows from the name claim that the same name will have different senses for different people. Every name is multiplied and unfathomably ambiguous. For if names are equivalent to definite descriptions, they are equivalent to different definite descriptions in different people's mouths. And for that matter, to different descriptions in the same person's mouth at different times, both because one's knowledge keeps fluctuating and because what is psychologically prominent about one person for another keeps fluctuating too. We have two examples here. Number 7, one and only one person wrote philosophy and the scientific image of man. And whoever wrote philosophy and the scientific image of man used to tie his shoes with one hand. Another example is one and only one person was a philosopher more famous than any other in Pittsburgh. And whoever was a philosopher more famous than any in Pittsburgh did no such a thing as tie his shoes with one hand. And the two statements would be entirely compatible from a logical point of view. What looked like a spirited dispute verging on fist fight is no real dispute at all. We are merely talking past each other, but that seems quite wrong. And that's the end of my report. Thank you.
Searle's cluster theory. In light of the two objections to Russell's version of the description theory, John Searle offered a looser and more sophisticated variant. John Searle suggested that a name is associated not with any particular description, but with a vague cluster of description. As he puts, the first of these is N, where n is replaced by a proper name, is to assert that a sufficient but so far unspecified number of standard identifying statements associated with the name are true of the object demonstrated by the word this. That is, the name refers to whatever object satisfies a sufficient but vague and unspecified number, or SBVAUN, of the descriptions generally associated with it. Searle adds the metaphysical claim that to be the person N is to have a sufficient but vague and unspecified number of the relevant properties. This cluster theory allows Searle to avoid the two objections we have raised for Russell's view. Objection 1 is mooted because Searle has abandoned the commitment that for each name there must be some one particular description that it expresses. Objection 2 is blunted because Searle believes by the fact that different people can have different subclusters of descriptive material in mind, yet each have a sufficient but vague and unspecified number of identifying descriptions and thereby succeed in referring to the same individual. Kripke's critique in Objection 3. Suppose that Richard Nixon is equivalent to the winner of the 1968 U.S. presidential election. And now consider a question about possibility. Questions about possibility and necessity are called model questions. Could Richard Nixon have lost the 1968 election? The answer seems unequivocally to be yes, assuming that could here expresses merely the theoretical, logical, or metaphysical possibility rather than something about the state of our knowledge. But according to the description theory, our question means the same as in sentence 9. Is it possible that one and only one person won the 1968 election, and whoever won the 1968 election lost the 1968 election? The answer to which is clearly no. Searle's cluster theory may seem to offer an improvement because it is possible that a person who satisfies a sufficient but vague and unspecified number of the description cluster associated with Richard Nixon nonetheless does not satisfy the particular description winner of the 1968 election. But Kripke points out human possibility extends further than that. Nixon, the individual person, might not have done any of the things generally associated with him. With this objection, Michael Dummett in year 1973 has protested that objection 3 is simply invalid as it stands, at least it rests on a hidden false assumption. We may infer that our model question is synonymous with sentence 9 only by assuming that if Richard Nixon is equivalent to a description at all, it is equivalent to one that has narrow scope in the terminology. That is a secondary occurrence with respect to it is possible that what if the relevant description has wide scope? Then, our original question is synonymous not with sentence 9 but with sentence 10. One and only one person won the 1968 election, and concerning whoever won the 1968 election, is it possible that a person lost? Sentence 10 is clumsy. There are other irrelevant disambiguations of our question due to the fact that interrogative operator itself has scope. So let me make the point more simply using just the indicative versions of the two readings the sentence. In sentence 11, it is possible for Richard Nixon to have lost the 1968 election, presuming that Richard Nixon is equivalent to the winner of the 1968 election, is ambiguous as between the narrow scope reading, which corresponds to sentence 11 and is false. I have represented lost as did not win and the wide scope reading, which presumably is true. Colloquially, sentence 11 means that one and only one person won the election and whoever won it is such that she or he could have lost. In a similar but more sophisticated move, some philosophers have finessed objection 3 by rigidifying the descriptions in terms of which they explicate names. Understand Richard Nixon not as the winner of the 1968 election, but as the actual winner of the 1968 election.
Objection 4.
Kripke offers an example regarding Gödel's incompleteness theorem, a famous mathematical result. In Kripke's fiction, the theorem was proved in the 1920s by a man named Schmidt, who died mysteriously without publishing it. Kurt Gödel came along, appropriated the manuscript, and scurrilously published it under his own name. Now, most people know Gödel, if all, as the man who proved the incompleteness theorem. Yet it seems clear that even those who know nothing else about Gödel utter the name Gödel. They do refer to Gödel rather than to the entirely unknown Schmidt. For example, when they say Gödel proved the incompleteness theorem, they are speaking falsely, however well justified they may be in our belief or in their belief. This objection too goes against Searle's cluster theory, as well as against the classical Russellian view. Suppose no one in fact proved the incompleteness theorem. Schmidt's alleged proof was irreparably flawed, or perhaps there was not even any Schmidt, but the proof simply materialized by a random scattering of atoms on a piece of paper. Here, it is even more random or obviously true that most people uses of Gödel refer to Gödel rather than to anyone else at all. Yet, those uses are not even backed by the Searle cluster. Let us consider the sentence 12. Some people are unaware that C0 is tally. This statement is ostensibly true, but if the name claim is correct, the statement is hard to interpret, for there is no single proposition denoted by the word that clause that the community of normal English speaker expresses by C0 is tally. Since C0 and tally are equivalent to different description for different people, there is no single fact. Now, if we assert presumably its complement clause expresses what C0 is tally means, but which we know that C0 is tally, we associate the name or the same set of description, whatever the might, with both names. Suppose that, like most philosophers, we associate both Cicero and Tully with a famous Roman orator who denounced Catiline and who figures in some famous example of Quines. Then sentence 12 is equivalent to sentence 13. Some people are unaware that one and only one person was a famous Roman, and one only one person was a famous Roman, and whoever was a famous Roman was a famous Roman. So that massively redundant sentence is equivalent to sentence 14. Some people are unaware that one and only one person was a famous Roman orator who denounced Catiline and who figures in some famous example of Quines. No doubt sentence 14 is true, but surely it does not express what sentence 12 means, even when sentence 12 is uttered by me. So it is far from obvious how Shirley might handle objection 5 either. In objection 6, if the name claim is true, then every name is backed by a description that applies uniquely to the name's referent. But most people associate Cicero only with a famous Roman orator or some other indefinite description and say Richard Feynman, only with a leading contemporary theoretical physicist. Yet these people succeed not only in those using name correctly, but also in referring Cicero and to Feynman respectively when did they sue. Moreover, two names of the same person such as Cicero and Tully may well have some indefinite description as backing, and when they do, no Russellian theory can explain their continuing failure to substitute in belief context. More generally, it does not take much to succeed in referring to a person, according to Keith Donnellan in year 1970. He offers an example in which a child who has gone to bed and to sleep is awakened briefly by his parents. They have with them Tom, an old friend of the family, who is visiting and wanted just to see the child. The parents say, "This is our friend Tom." Tom says, "Hello, youngster," and the episode is over. The child has only barely woken. In the morning, the child wakes with a vague memory that Tom is a nice man. But the child has no descriptive material at all associated with the name Tom. He may not even remember that Tom was the person that he was semi-awake to meet during the night. Yet, Donnellan argues that does not prevent him from succeeding in referring to Tom. There is a person who is being said to be a nice man, and it is Tom. In the objection 7, Russell emphatically wanted his theory to apply to fictional names such as Hamlet and Sherlock Holmes and the free lunch. If the name claim is correct, then any sentence containing the fictional name in a primary or wide scope position will come out of false. For example, sentence 15, Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street, will come out false because it is supposed to be equivalent to sentence 16. One and only one person was, that is, or there exists exactly one person who was, a famous detective too, and whoever was a famous detective who lived at 221B Baker Street. And false, but some fictional sentences, such as sentence 15 itself and Hamlet was a Dane, are true sentences or any at rate not false ones. Russell would not have been much swayed by this argument, since he had no inclination to call it true, as opposed to merely make believe true or true in fiction, that Holmes lives at Baker Street or whatever. If it is true that Holmes lived in Baker Street, then it would be true of Baker Street, a real place to this day, that it had Holmes living in it. Also, if such sentences were true just in virtue of someone's having written them in popular books or stories, then it would be equally true that Holmes existed, Hamlet existed, and so on. Since people say those things in books and stories, this point is strangely overlooked. Yet some people want to insist that fictional sentences are literally truth valueless rather than false. If you are sympathetic to this, you will want to hold a Kripken theory of fictional names rather than Russell's. So Donnellan defends such a theory in more detail. Kripke has a further and in a way more fundamental objection to the description theory, but it requires a bit of technical apparatus. That apparatus is one we will be needing again in a way that shall develop it in the next chapter.
Next part, we'll talk about the proper names, direct reference, and the causal historical theory. Possible worlds. There are a number of ways the world might have been. To put it slightly more fancifully, there are alternative worlds. Different worlds, worlds that could have been ours, but that are only possible and not actual. Think of an array of possible universes corresponding to the infinitely many ways in which things, very broadly speaking, might have gone. All these possible worlds represent an actual global possibilities. Now, obviously, a sentence's truth, even when we hold the sentence's meaning fixed, depends on which world we are considering. For example, Brown is Prime Minister is true in the actual world, but since Brown need not have been Prime Minister, there are countless worlds in which Brown is Prime Minister is false. In those worlds, Brown did not succeed Tony Blair, or never went into politics, or never even existed. And in some other worlds, someone else is Prime Minister, so a given sentence or proposition varies its truth value from world to world. Just as sentences change their truth values from world to world, a given singular term may vary its referent from world to world. This is why the description's referent changes from world to world. Let us call such a singular term, one that designates different things in different worlds, a flaccid designator. It contrasts specifically with what Kripke calls a rigid designator, a term that is not flaccid, that does not change its referent from world to world, but denotes the very same item in every world, at least in every world in which that item exists. Rigidity and proper names. Now, we are able to state Kripke's further objection to description theories of proper names. A definite description of the sort Russell had in mind is flaccid, as has just been illustrated. Yet, proper names, Kripke says, do not usually vary their reference across worlds or hypothetical situations in that way. Names are normally, in that sense, rigid designators, keeping the same referent from world to world, whereas resilient descriptions are flaccid. Thus, names are not equivalent to resilient descriptions. Kripke offers a further little intuitive test for telling whether a term is rigid. Try the term, the sentence, frame, and might not have been N. Kripke argues that when one uses the name Nixon to refer to a person in this world, and then starts describing hypothetical scenarios or alternative possible worlds, continuing to use the name, one is talking about the same person. So if you ask, might Nixon have joined the Black Panthers rather than becoming president? The answer may be yes or maybe no. But the scenario you are considering is one in which Nixon, that very person, is a Black Panther, not one in which whoever or whatever was the US president was a Panther. You are not imagining a world in which a Black Panther is president of the US. Thus, even if a name in someone's mouth at a time has a firm psychological association with a particular description in that person's mind, it does not follow that the name is equivalent to the description in meaning. For all that has been shown, when the person obligingly coughs up the description in the response to a spot check, the person is merely identifying the name's referent. Now, direct reference. A million name is one that makes no propositional contribution but its bearer or referent. Its sole function is to introduce that individual into discourse. It lends nothing else to the meaning of a sentence in which it occurs. If we say Jason is fat and Jason is a standard proper name, then the meaning of that sentence consists simply of the person Jason himself, concatenated with the property of being fat. However, other philosophers have championed the Milan conception, which has come to be called the direct reference theory of names. The latter theorists have extended direct reference to cover some other singular terms, notably personal and demonstrative pronouns such as I, you, she, this and that, as well as names. Now, the causal historical theory. The idea then is that my utterance of Feynman, for example, is the most recent link in a causal historical chain of reference borrowings, whose first link is the event of the infant Feynman's being given that name. I get that name from somebody, who got it from somebody else, who got it from somebody else, who got it from somebody else, all the way back to the naming ceremony. It might be thought that ambiguous names born by more than one person, pose a problem for the causal historical view. Example, John Brown is ambiguous as between the former Scott's Gilly who befriended Queen Victoria after Albert's death, or the monomaniacal field farmer who invaded Harper's Ferry in 1859, and doubtless thousands of other males of the English-speaking world. Now, there are problems for the causal historical theory. The causal historical view's key notion is that of the passing on of reference from one person to another. But not just any such transfer will do. First, we must rule out that naming after phenomenon. Naming after is a link in a causal historical chain. To rule it out, Kripke requires that when the name is passed from link to link, the receiver of the name must intend, when he learns it, to use it with the same reference as the man from whom he heard it. Now, there are objections. Objection number one is, can the causal historical theories accommodate empty names or names that have no actual bearers? Second, Evans 1973 points out that names can change their reference, unbeknownst through mishap or error. But the causal historical theory as presented so far cannot allow for that. According to Evans, the name Madagascar originally named not the great African island, but a portion of the mainland. The change was ultimately due to a misunderstanding of Marco Polo's. Third, objection. We can misidentify the object of a naming ceremony. An impostor could be given a name without the namer knowing it was a different one. Fourth, people can be categorically mistaken in their beliefs about reference. Devitt and Sterling call this the qua problem. They concede that the celebrant at a naming ceremony or other person responsible for any of a name's groundings must not be categorically mistaken and must indeed intend to refer to something of the appropriate category. This is a mild concession to descriptivism. Now, let's proceed to natural kind terms and twin earth. Kripke and Hilary Putnam went on to extend both the semantic theory of rigid designation and the causal historical theory of referring from singular terms to some predicates or general terms, chiefly natural kind terms, common nouns of the sort that refer to natural substances or organisms like gold, water, molybdenum, tiger, and aardvark. Such expressions are not singular terms since they do not purport to apply to just one thing. But Kripke and Putnam argued that they are more like names than they are like adjectives. Semantically, they are rigid. Each refers to the same natural kind in every world in which that kind has membership. And some version of the causal historical theory characterizes the referring use.